I would like to introduce you to and have come up to the podium Dr. Howard Zehr. Dr. Zehr is one of the world's most known thinkers in restorative justice and has written several books on the subject. And when you want to know about something, go to the expert. He's a professor of this subject at Eastern Mennonite University. And I now turn the floor over to Dr. Howard Zehr.
Well, thank you, and it's an honor to be here with you today. I want to particularly, some of you are community members, some of you are in government. After just what we've heard about the limited resources, I particularly want to thank you busy professionals who've taken time out today to engage with some of these ideas. I would guess that some of you here, I know some of you here are restorative justice advocates and practitioners. I would assume that some of you here are also skeptical. I certainly was when I first encountered this. You may wonder whether this is really helpful, whether it's really practical, whether it's going to make your weight caseloads heavier. You might wonder whether it might just kumbaya, that's often the idea that gets associated with this. You may wonder whether this, sure, it sounds good for kids, but is it useful for adults? My goal here today isn't trying to convince you anything. What I think, as the chief said, that the situation you're in can actually be an opportunity. And we don't stop and think creatively when things are funded and going normally. And in my experience, sometimes these kind of crises can lead us to think more creatively. And so I'm hoping that the engagement with these ideas today will get us to think creatively, not necessarily that we're going to pick up what somebody else did and try to do it, but to think creatively around it. So I was asked to give kind of an overview of restorative justice as a field, and Ted will be doing that too, so between the two of us, hopefully we cover it pretty well. Restorative justice as a field began in so-called lesser offenses. When we first started, we were doing almost entirely property crimes. We were doing vandalism. We did a lot of burglary cases. We found that burglary was really, really effective because victims experience it as a violent crime in many ways. When I interview victims of a crime, I sometimes can't tell the difference between a burglary victim and a rape victim if they don't tell me the details. The sense of violation is so high, and yet law enforcement rarely has, and the courts rarely has time to give to that needs to have. So we did a lot of those cases in the early days. We started with juvenile cases and eventually began to move into adult cases. Later this morning I'll tell you about our first adult case. It was quite interesting. We began by working at probation at sentencing stage. As were the cases, they came from the court through probation. Either before sentence, after plea, before sentence, or after sentence. But it began to move around the country and different parts of the world to various stages, the prosecutorial stage to law enforcement stage. Some of the most interesting programs right now are being operated in collaboration with law enforcement. I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. We started with so-called lesser crimes. I say so-called because I do a lot of training and things around victim issues, and one of the things I try to help people understand is that people go through a kind of set of traumatic responses, and the so-called severity of the crime isn't necessarily the determining factor of how they experience it. So that so-called minor crimes can be almost or maybe even as traumatic as a major crime. And a lot of times people working in the system don't understand that, don't understand why victims are working the way they, operating the way, or reacting the way they do. It started kind of, well, it started with more minor crimes. It moved now into more severe crimes. And so Oregon, as well, like half of the states, have programs now that do not affect the disposition of the case, but for victims who want to meet their offender in prison, it can be done. And the research is very, very promising on what that means for both sides. And of course, we can tell those kind of stories too if you want. It began sort of outside the system with community groups, but in some communities, very excitingly, it's led to new forms of collaboration that are redefining the relationship between the so-called system and the community. One of those, for instance, is in Massachusetts, where a former student of mine, Jennifer Larson-Sawin, directs a program called Communities for Restorative Justice that's operated in collaboration with and out of the police department. And Len Weatherby, who retired from that recently, chief of police, is a very, very strong advocate of restorative justice. He talks about how it's reduced their caseload in certain kinds of cases. It's allowed them to close cases they couldn't close and so forth. So there's some really innovative things being done. And in the long run, what I hope is it does cause a new relationship between community and justice professionals. It began with a model which you have many communities here, victim-offender conferencing or victim-offender mediation. But then other forms of encounter began to emerge. One of the most interesting is in New Zealand, family group conferencing, which is being applied. It's a larger group of people. But in New Zealand, it was actually used only for juveniles in New Zealand, but it was actually used as a way to reduce court loads, reduce police loads, and to resolve cases in a more restorative way. And again, there's a book back there about that if you're interested in it. But it's something that they had one of the highest incarceration rates for young people in the world. The Maori people of New Zealand, who are the indigenous people, were the highest percentage of people in that. They knew they had to do something, and the Maori were saying, this is institutionally racist. And out of that came this new process that reduced their jail use and so forth. I've had judges tell me I went from working 5 days a week, all day on the court with juvenile matters, to going to half a day a week as a result of this restructuring. And then there's something called circle processes, circle sentences, that originally were used to provide a more community input, victim offender community input into sentencing processes, now being used for all different kinds of things. So there's a variety of encounter programs that allow victims and offenders to safely encounter one another when they choose to do that. But it's much more than that. It's a continuum of responses that is informed by a set of principles, which I will talk about in a minute. It's not always practical to bring victims and offenders together. So a variety of things have worked out. For instance, some of my students are running a program in a local detention center. It's a combination detention center, work release, where victims are coming in, talking to the guys, helping the guys understand the impact of their behavior and to be able to take responsibility for it. There were three major concerns that drove us in the early years of this field that continue to drive it. One of those that we've already heard about, and that's the question of offender accountability. We became aware that our system, we punish a lot of people. We have one of the highest incarceration rates in the world. We don't hold them accountable. Accountability would be helping people to understand the impact of their behavior and to take responsibility for that harmful act of their. There's another text for it, Chris. If you think about what we do, the way offenders do what they do is by using all kinds of excuses and rationalizations to insulate themselves from the consequences of what they do. I've had burglars say, I went in the house and I turned the family pictures against the wall so I wouldn't think about the fact that I was hurting someone. And then we put them in a system where the central principle is, as a judge friend of mine says, make the state prove it. So, they say, plead not guilty. So no matter how guilty, how remorseful you are, you plead not guilty. And then we put them in a prison where there's no culture of taking responsibility. I sometimes say it's like we designed a system to reinforce the very mechanism that offenders use to get in trouble in the first place. Just doesn't quite make sense. The second thing that drove us was we realized how neglected victims were in this process and how re-traumatized they often are. I've done a lot of work with victims now over the years. In fact, until recently, I was on the victim advisory group for the U.S. Sentencing Commission. But that's how concerned I am about victims in this thing. And I think there's a whole group of needs that people have when they've been harmed. But there's a group that call what I call justice needs. There's 4 or 5 things that victims need from a justice process. And in my experience, when they seem to be stuck, it's often because those needs haven't been met. And when they seem to be able to move on, it's because they have. I don't have time to talk about it in detail. I'll talk about it more tonight in the public lecture. But there are things like information. They need information about what really happened and what the person is like and why they did the things and so forth. And law enforcement and courts rarely have the full picture. They need a chance to tell their story. They're trying to restore the story of their lives, and they're trying to incorporate it, so they need to tell their stories. They need to be a sense of empowerment. When someone breaks into your home or holds you at knife point, they have power over you, but when you can't get them out of your head, you know, you have this anger, there's memories and so forth, it's like somebody's still in control of you. And we know from our studies, even in the regular court process, the more you involve victims, the more likely they are to say they got justice. So they need to be empowered, and then they need things to be balanced out in some way. They need things like restitution, not because restitution is necessary, the money is necessarily important, but it's that statement that I'm taking responsibility and you are not responsible. It's that balancing of the score. I'll talk more about that tonight. And the third one was community engagement. We realized that we were turning these things over to professionals, leaving the community out. And as a judge friend of mine says, the reason our communities are so weak is because communities grow when they solve problems together. And if we don't engage the community in this, we are actually stealing an opportunity, as one person has said, for the community to grow. So those are the kind of things that drove it. We first started by bringing victims and offenders together, but today, as I said, there's a whole variety of ways of working at that. But behind it is really a set of principles. And by the way, the research is very, on the encounter groups, the research is very positive. Victim satisfaction is much higher when they go through this process. The big study in England that looked at programs around the world said that there's so much reduced traumatic stress that we have seen in this that if they told the British government, if you did this on a national level, I think it would reduce the cost of health care because of the coronary disease and all of that is increased by these stresses. Offender recidivism normally is reduced by a quarter to a third at least, and when people recommit, it's usually less serious offenses in our experience. Just lots of good research on it. But it isn't necessarily a particular program or a model. It's a way of looking at wrongdoing, a way of looking at the world. You know, our legal system basically asks three questions. It says, well, what laws are broken, and then who did it, and what do they deserve? Restorative justice says, look, there's some other questions that are important. Who's been hurt in this situation, and what are their needs, and whose obligations are they? Because essentially, restorative justice is saying that the fundamental harm, the fundamental wrong, is the harm that you've done to people and relationships. Crime harms people and relationships. As one judge, former judge, has just written, it's a destruction of trust. One of the fundamental harms of crime is it destroys our trust in the individual, in our communities, and so forth. And whenever we harm somebody, the second principle is we have an obligation. That obligation is to try to put right the wrong as much as we can. And the third principle is the principle of engagement. Those who are impacted have a stake in this situation as much as possible ought to be involved in it. So the question isn't, how can I apply this model to this situation? The question for me in every situation is, well, what are the harms that have happened here? And what are the needs that have come out of those harms? And whose obligations are they? Probably the offender has a major obligation, but some of the rest of us may as well. And how can we engage the appropriate people in a process to work at these things? So it's really about a set of principles. It's a set of principles that is underlaying that is a set of values. And I think it's important to name those. I talk about the 3 R's. That one is respect. I'm really convinced that a lot of offending behavior is an effort to get respect in these crazy and illegitimate ways. And that when we don't respect offenders in the justice process, it just, like with violence begets violence. Disrespect begets disrespect. And when I talk with victims, a lot of the trauma they experience is a disrespect they felt by the offender, by their families who tell them, don't want to hear it, say things like, you need to move on, you shouldn't be so angry, you need to forgive. By law enforcement, fairly or not, a lot of times it's unfair, but they just feel really disrespected. So I think the fundamental thing is how can we give people an experience of respect? That's the value. The second one is responsibility. We live in such an individualistic society where we emphasize rights so much and so little on responsibility. And what we're trying to do with restorative justice is to help people understand that we all have responsibilities. And the third is relationship, a reminder that we live in relationship with each other and that our behavior affects each other. We live in this individualistic society that doesn't remind us of that very much. So it's really an effort to get us to stop as communities to think about what are our fundamental needs, what are our resources, and what are our values. Ideally, as I said, I believe the best programs are close collaboration between people in the so-called system and in the community. And I'm more and more encouraged at the possibility for this kind of thing to begin changing that relationship from what it has been historically. So I think the research is positive. I've put a lot of my career into this field, but there are challenges, and there's a lot we don't know. I often say I wish we had another 10 years before Oprah discovered us, because we're just early on the learning curve at this point. Some of the challenges are that it's often misunderstood and misused. Restorative justice is so popular today that I've heard all kinds of stuff called restorative justice. And I mean, I was in Northern Ireland one time where restorative justice is a big thing, and there was a revenge shooting, and there was a politician on the radio saying we've got to stop this restorative justice. That was, pretty far from what I had in mind. We don't always live up to our promise. I think we in the field have oversold sometimes and not been aware of our limitations. It does force us to think outside the usual training. Law training doesn't exactly, for instance, teach us to think this way. But there's an increasing number of lawyers, I'm happy to say, who are starting to do restorative practice in the law. I just last fall held a conference for a number of those, and we learned what various people were doing as lawyers as a way to apply this thing. And many people are reporting significant impacts on their life and work. I was just with Fred Van Loo, who just retired as prosecutor. In 1991, he'd been both juvenile and also severe crime, adult crime prosecutor. In 1991, he was about to give this up. He discovered restorative justice, began to implement this into his work, and it gave him a whole new vision for prosecution that kept him going until recently. And now he established a center to help other communities engage in restorative justice. So I'm not asking people to be true believers. In fact, I'm kind of scared of true believers. I always tell my class, I would much rather be skeptical than to be a true believer. The true believer that believes there could be no problems and there's, it's answered everything, that scares me. I'd much rather have conversations with skeptics, and hopefully some of you in this room are skeptics, so we can have that kind of conversation today. Thank you.